Kata is something you practice, not something you watch. Read the lesson, write the code yourself, then review what you wrote. This video is the reference you come back to afterwards. A model can produce this code in seconds, and the reason to write it by hand is to keep the judgment that tells you whether the code is any good. Every application ends up with the same handful of browser behaviors. Close this when someone clicks outside it. Do something different on a narrow screen. Open the search box on a keyboard shortcut. Written inline, each of those is a ref, a listener, an effect, and a cleanup tangled into a component that was supposed to be about something else. This lesson is about pulling that class of thing out into hooks and about the specific details that make each one correct, because all three of the examples here have a detail that is easy to get wrong and hard to notice. The term is not a React concept, it is a useful label. A behavioral hook is a custom hook whose job is an interaction with the browser rather than a piece of your application's data. The list on screen is the usual set: clicking outside, media queries, keyboard shortcuts, trapping, focus, observing intersection. What they have in common is a shape. Each one attaches something to a global object, watches it, keeps a small piece of state, and tears the whole thing down on the way out. Once you have written two of them, the third is mostly filling in the middle. Take a ref and a callback, and call the callback when a click lands anywhere that is not inside that element. The implementation is a pointer down listener on the document and a check on each event asking whether the ref's node contains the event target. Two things about that check are worth stating. Contains is a DOM method, and it returns true for the element itself as well as its descendants, which is what you want. And the ref might be null on the first render or after unmount, so the check has to survive that. The dropdown on screen is the case everybody needs, and the notes underneath it are the detail that makes it work. Listen for pointer down rather than click. A click event only fires after the button is released, and by that point focus has already moved, so a drop-down that closes on click can flicker or lose a selection that was made on the way down. Pointer down fires first and behaves predictably. It is also the one event that covers a mouse, a finger, and a stylus, which is why it is the modern choice over mouse down. The other note matters just as much. The handler you pass in should be stable. Pass a fresh arrow function on every render, and the effects dependencies change every render. So the listener is removed and re-added constantly. Wrap it in use callback or accept that the hook is doing far more work than it looks like. This one subscribes to a media query and returns whether it currently matches. Match media gives you an object with a matches property and its own change event. So the hook reads the value once, then listens for changes and updates state. It is a small hook, and the interesting part is the cleanup, which removes the listener, and the initial read, which has to happen before the first paint or the component renders the wrong branch and then corrects itself visibly. The panel on screen is worth more than the hook because it answers a question people get wrong constantly. Use CSS media queries for showing and hiding, for layout, for spacing, for font sizes. Use this hook when the decision changes what React renders. A different component tree, different behavior, a different data request. The difference is not stylistic. CSS costs nothing and applies before your JavaScript has run. A hook costs a subscription, a piece of state, and a re-render on every change. Reaching for it to hide a sidebar is paying for a mechanism you did not need. Listen for a key combination and run something when it fires. The implementation checks the modifier flags on the event alongside the key itself, and the important line is the one that prevents the default. Take Ctrl+K or Command+K, which is what most applications use for search. The browser has its own meaning for several of those combinations, and without preventing the default, you get both yours and the browser's. Worth noting the platform detail too. Control on Windows and Linux is Command on a Mac, so the check has to look at both, and users on either platform will assume theirs is the one that works. Press the combination and the panel opens. What is worth looking at is how little the component knows. It calls the hook with a combination and a function, and the entire business of attaching a listener, comparing modifiers, canceling the browser's default, and cleaning up afterwards has gone somewhere else. That is the return you get for extracting a behavior rather than a value. The component stops containing any browser code at all. The section on screen makes a claim that is worth understanding rather than accepting. These compose without conflicting. The reason is that each hook owns its own effect and its own cleanup, and effects are independent of one another. A component can use all three at once, and each will attach and detach on its own schedule. That is not a special property of behavioral hooks. It is the property of hooks in general, and this is simply where it becomes obviously useful. The practical version, one hook per behavior, and a component that needs three behaviors calls three hooks. The list on screen is good, and two entries deserve emphasis. Accept a ref as a parameter rather than creating one inside the hook, because the component usually needs that ref for its own markup, and a hook that hides it forces an awkward dance to get it back. And stabilize the callbacks you pass in for the reason we covered with the dropdown. An unstable callback resubscribes on every render, which is invisible until you look at what the effect is actually doing. The server-side note is real too. Match media and document do not exist during server rendering, so a hook that touches them without checking will throw the moment the page is rendered on a server. A behavioral hook wraps a browser interaction, not a piece of data. They all have the same shape: subscribe, keep a little state, clean up, pointer down beats click for outside click detection, and covers touch and pen as well. Prefer CSS to a media query hook unless the decision changes what renders. Prevent the default when you claim a keyboard combination, and check both control and command. Stabilize the callbacks and keep each hook to one behavior, because that is what lets them compose. A drop down with the behavior written inline, a ref, an effect, a listener on the document, a check against the ref, a cleanup, and somewhere in the middle of all that, the actual drop down. Read it and try to find the part that is about this feature rather than about the browser. It is a handful of lines surrounded by plumbing. Now imagine the second component that needs the same thing, and the third, each with its own copy of the listener and its own opportunity to forget the cleanup or use click instead of pointer down. The same component with the behavior extracted. The hook takes the ref and a callback. The component keeps the ref because it needs it for the markup anyway and calls the hook with it. What is left in the component is the dropdown and nothing else. Look at the hook itself as well, because it is where the correctness now lives in one place: the pointer down listener, the contains check, the null guard on the ref, and the cleanup. Fix a bug there, and every dropdown in the application is fixed with it, which is the argument for extraction stated in its most practical form. The last variant runs all three hooks in one component, which is the composition claim made concrete. The dropdown closes on an outside click, the layout responds to a media query, and a keyboard combination toggles the search panel. Read the top of the component and count the hook calls: 3 lines, 3 behaviors, and no browser code anywhere in the body. Then look at what each hook is doing underneath and notice that all three end with a cleanup. 3 subscriptions to 3 different global things, each undone by the hook that made it. That is the shape worth taking away more than any of the individual implementations. The model to keep is a division of labor. Browser interactions have a common shape: subscribe, hold a little state, tear it down, and that shape belongs in a hook where it can be got right once. Your component keeps the part that is about your application. When you next find yourself writing a listener inside a component, ask whether it is really about this component or about the browser, and if it is the browser, give it a name beginning with use and move it out. The kata is the part that matters. Open the lesson, write the code yourself, then read back what you wrote and judge it. The link is in the description, and that practice is what keeps the skill yours.